Under a moon so full it washed the desert in silver, a convoy moved quietly across the dusty Sonoran highway, 3 SUVs in a line, the first carrying a family returning from a wedding in a town miles away, their laughter and music fading behind them, the third carrying children asleep in the back, their dreams unknowing, while up ahead, in the shadows of twisted mesquite and horizon ridges, shapes shifted and eyes glinted, as though the night itself held its breath. The air smelled of cooling rock and dry sage, a coyote's cry in the distance. Winds kicked sand against doors. Yet inside those cars, normal lives played out, a mother smoothing her daughter's hair, a father adjusting the rearview mirror, a bride in the back holding tightly to her bouquet, believing the worst that night would be traffic or a tire blowout, nothing darker. But shadows are never as empty as we hope. A pair of headlights flickered in a side canyon that no one should have been using, a text message left unread, whispered coordinates passed between 2 men in a white pickup, careful footsteps behind scrub. The sort of details people ignore in the safety of day, but under stars they matter, every one of them a thread tied to what came next. At precisely 0:12, time warped, the lead SUV coasted over gravel, crunch echoed, the second car's engine revved as though whispering a warning. And then, like lightning, the air exploded, one shot, then hundreds, metal screamed, glass shattered, the night's calm broken by chaos. Mothers trapped behind locked doors. Children jolted awake, their world disintegrating. And somewhere, under gunfire, someone prayed. Bullets ripped through engines, tires birthed spray of gravel, the first vehicle spun into dust, screaming tires, the second lurched, doors flung open, people scrambling, footsteps pounding in sand, voices hollering in Spanish, someone pulling a child, someone dragging a wounded man, a motorbike's headlamp thrown aside, scent of burning rubber and petrol sharp in the lungs. In the dim hours before dawn, when stars still clung to sky, 2 children, blood on their clothes, fear carving lines across their faces, hid behind mesquite, a woman, her breathing shallow, crawled into brush, a man, shot in the leg, limped, one hand over his mouth to hold back screams, others stunned, frozen, neither moving nor knowing whether to run or wait for death's echo to pass. But while survival flickered in soft gasp and heartbeat, far away in a small kitchen lit by yellow bulb, a husband kissed his wife goodnight. In a quiet settlement, a mother tucked her children under quilts, and those households would shatter before sunrise once the phones began to ring and messages came through. They attacked us, they killed them. Dawn's first light stretched over the hills, and with it the shadow of what had begun. One SUV burned black, its metal carcass smoking, another vehicle overturned in scrub, one last car abandoned, its occupants gone or gone silent, bodies strewn, shoes, rosaries, wedding ribbons caught in barbed wire, human fragility laid bare. Helicopters roared above, clipboards shook in hands, reporters shouting questions nobody yet had answers to, officials in crisp uniforms stepping through the wreckage, goggles and gloves, cameras buzzing, but no single person yet willing to say who fired first, who betrayed whom, what map led to this. Families, survivors, witnesses all limping toward truth, each carrying a piece of what happened, none yet whole. And in the silence that followed the smoke, from the ragged edges of grief, a single name slipped into conversation at bus stops, whispered in prayers, repeated in anger, betrayal. Someone who knew the convoy's schedule. Someone who led the convoy into a kill zone. Someone close. What follows is the search, through lies, through terror, through death, for who pulled the trigger, and why. For in Sonora, when bullets fly, it's the secrets that kill most.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
In the years before that terrible November morning, the Sonoran desert carried more than just trucks and traders. It carried whispers, whispers of power, of loyalty, of death. Every grain of sand between Bavispe and Agua Prieta seemed to hum with cartel radio codes, while ranchers, farmers, and families went about their lives pretending not to hear. The same roads that hauled cattle and corn also carried cocaine and fear, and for those who called this stretch of Mexico home, silence was survival. Decades earlier, when Mormon settlers established their communities in these valleys, La Mora, Colonia LeBaron, and the surrounding ranches, they came seeking peace and faith, raising children under the sun, tilling land, and building lives with both hands and hope. They were outsiders, yet deeply rooted, Mexicans by citizenship, Americans by lineage, people of two nations who believed their remoteness protected them from the world's chaos. But over time, that isolation became a curse, because when violence came, it came alone, and help was hours away. And around them, the cartels grew restless. Los Jaguars, a fearsome faction of the Sinaloa cartel led by Francisco Arvizu, known only as El Jaguar, tightening control across Sonora. Into the east, La Linea, the blood-soaked armed wing of the Juarez cartel, pushing deeper into enemy territory. What once was a hidden rivalry erupted into open conflict, ambushes on dirt roads, kidnappings on ranches, burning vehicles left as warnings. Everyone in these valleys knew that the war for control wasn't about land anymore. It was about dominance, fear, and the power to make entire towns disappear. In those months leading up to the massacre, intelligence reports whispered of shifting borders, convoys of armed men seen in Agua Prieta, unmarked trucks stationed near Bavisp, checkpoints that weren't military but cartel-run. Rumors spread through ranch radios that La Linea was preparing something bold, something designed to show Sinaloa that Sonora was no longer theirs. Yet the families, accustomed to desert dangers, carried on with daily life, baptisms, weddings, and journeys across the border. Routine dulled fear, until fear became routine. But the deeper truth was this: for years, La Linea and Los Jaguars fought a secret war that no one outside these lands could fully see. These were not gangs, they were armies with code names, radios, drones, and informants planted in police stations. And the LeBarons, though neutral, were an easy target for a message, a warning shot disguised as a mistake, a statement written in blood on a desert road. That morning, the 3 SUVs rolled out of La Mora as the sun climbed over the horizon. Inside were mothers and children, 9 lives that would change Mexico forever. Ronita, Donna, Cristina, 3 women bound by family and faith, unaware that their route through the Sierra Madre would cross paths with armed men convinced that the vehicles ahead were not families, but enemies. Radios crackled in the hills. Orders were given. And miles away, the convoy drove into fate. Federal intelligence later revealed that the region had already been a powder keg. Sinaloa hitmen seen near Moctezuma, La Linea convoys crossing toward Agua Prieta, rumors of a shootout between factions hours before. Yet the families didn't know. How could they? Their phones were off, their eyes on the road, their faith in God and good sense stronger than fear. But in a land where suspicion kills faster than bullets, good intentions no longer mattered. Back in nearby towns, people spoke of warnings ignored, of mothers told not to travel, of men whispering that something was happening near the border. Some remembered hearing gunfire the night before. Some said it was just cartels settling scores. No one thought a family would be next. And that's the tragedy of the Sonoran frontier. Danger is never sudden, it is slow, creeping, patient, until the day it arrives. At the same time, Mexico's political landscape was shifting like sand. New policies, weakened policing, and the slow erosion of federal control meant that local commanders often had to negotiate with whichever cartel held the nearest checkpoint. In that chaos, law and order became myths. And for the first time in years, Sonora's quiet roads, once symbols of isolation and safety, became killing grounds where no one knew which uniform, which truck, or which man could be trusted. By the time the LeBaron convoy entered that narrow stretch of road between La Mora and Llanos, fate was already sealed. The hills that once sheltered their ancestors' prayers now had gunmen waiting in ambush, radios tuned, rifles loaded, fingers trembling with adrenaline. And as the last SUV rolled past the bend, the desert wind fell still, as if the land itself was waiting to witness what history would call the Sonora Massacre. The news broke like wildfire, spreading first through whispers, then through shouts, and by nightfall, through every television and phone screen across Mexico and the United States. 9 killed, 3 mothers, 6 children, the headlines read. But what words cannot convey is the silence that followed, the silence of a community that had always believed distance was protection, faith was armor, and love was stronger than hate. That illusion was gone now, burned to ash in the desert wind. The LeBaron and Langford families gathered that night in kitchens and courtyards, huddled beneath dim bulbs, holding each other as if physical closeness could stop the mind from replaying what the eyes had seen. The smell of burnt metal and sorrow still clung to the air even miles away. Phone calls poured in, reporters, politicians, strangers offering prayers, others demanding vengeance, but inside those homes, only the sound of sobbing, of children asking questions adults couldn't answer. The next morning, convoys of military vehicles and forensic trucks crawled into the valley like a second invasion. Investigators in white suits stepped carefully through the blackened wrecks, labeling shells, measuring trajectories, taking photos, but what they didn't measure was the human cost. Mothers' shoes melted into the earth. Bullet casings gleamed under morning light like tiny suns. And over it all, the smell of death, of gasoline, of unanswered questions. Government officials promised swift justice, statements read in crisp tones before flashing cameras, words rehearsed, faces hardened. The president called it a tragedy, vowed to find those responsible. But in Sonora, where promises had long dissolved into dust, those words felt like paper shields against bullets. The families wanted truth, not statements, justice, not sympathy. And deep down, everyone knew the truth would be tangled in politics, corruption, and the unspoken alliances between law and blood. Soon, rumors became theories, and theories became suspicions. Some said it was a case of mistaken identity, that the gunmen believed the SUVs belonged to rival cartels. Others whispered darker versions, that someone tipped off the attackers, that the ambush was a message to someone powerful, a warning to the wrong people at the wrong time. In Mexico's shadow wars, truth is never simple. It bends, hides, gets buried beneath lies and paperwork. Over the next days, Sonora became an armed zone. Soldiers patrolled the burned highway. Journalists descended from every corner of the continent, their cameras capturing grief, outrage, and fear. Vigils were held in La Mora, mothers holding candles, fathers standing in silence, children clutching photos of siblings now gone. And above it all, drones hovered, filming tears for the world to watch, while the people living it wondered if the world would remember them tomorrow. Investigators soon arrested men said to be part of La Línea, the Juarez cartel's armed wing, foot soldiers, low-level operatives, those always caught while their bosses vanished into the folds of power. Each new arrest was followed by another headline, another promise. Yet the families, having lived through decades of Mexico's justice system, knew the difference between arrest and accountability. None of it brought the dead back. None of it explained why. Weeks later, as funerals stretched across two countries, coffins draped in flowers and flags, thousands gathered, Mexican farmers, American neighbors, reporters from far places, and together they watched as the desert wind carried hymns into the hills. The same hills where gunfire had once echoed now heard prayers instead. But even as tears dried, anger grew, because in Sonora, grief often hardens into defiance. From that anger rose demands, calls for justice, for protection, for the government to confront the cartels that rule the borderlands like ghosts with guns. The LeBarons went to the Capitol, meeting presidents, senators, even crossing into Washington, D.C. to speak before cameras and congressmen. Their message was simple: this cannot continue. No family should live in fear. Yet behind every word, behind every plea, was the image of those three burned cars, still etched in memory. But Mexico is a country of both beauty and brutality, where even justice bleeds slowly through layers of politics, where truth fades before reaching daylight. And so, the case drifted, updates thinning, promises cooling, families waiting. Still, when the desert wind rises over Sonora at night, some swear they can hear it, the echo of tires crunching gravel, the laughter of children, the last prayers whispered before the gunfire began. The land remembers, even when men forget. In the weeks after the massacre, analysts began peeling back layers of cartel politics that few outsiders understood. How Los Jaguars, once content to control smuggling across Sonora's remote passes, saw an opportunity in civic chaos. how La Linea coveted territory not just for trafficking, but for control of border crossings, influence over local businesses, washing of money, and the prestige that comes with being feared, and how, between those ambitions, personal grudges festered, a leader slighted in a negotiation, a pay cut ignored, a promise broken, small betrayals that, when stitched together, became a roadmap to violence. It emerged that messaging apps and intercepts had caught conversations between mid-level La Linea commanders speaking of packages in white cars matching descriptions of the SUVs. Other talks spoke of coordinating with someone inside security forces to be allowed safe passage. Some claimed someone saw trucks escorting the convoy without lights ahead of time. Others said a local rancher warned the families of danger, but his warning was ignored. Pieces of evidence, half-stories, leaked audio files, each weighed heavily, but each incomplete, like portions of a shattered mirror reflecting contradictory images. One of the greatest betrayals, investigators say, may have been from those sworn to protect. There were reports of police checkpoints near the route that never stopped the SUVs, or, when they did, let them pass after shaking them down lightly, perhaps turning away what later would have been fatal scrutiny. Some locals say that uniformed officers had cartel ties, or turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes. When police presence is inconsistent, suspicion fills the space, suspicion that cracks open trust in communities that already live with fear. At the same time, federal agencies brought in forensic experts, ballistic analysts tracing the markings on shell casings, trajectory experts reconstructing bullet paths through SUV windshields, metallurgists testing fragments of metal from the burned cars. Their findings disputed some early official claims, that the SUVs were mistaken for cartel vehicles, that the ambush was random. Instead, evidence suggested precision, calculation, gunmen positioned on ridgelines at a distance too far for casual crossfire, overlapping fields of fire, synchronized shots aimed at driver doors, passenger sides, fuel tanks, the kind of planning that required reconnaissance, coordination, nerves hardened by prior violence. Among these revelations was a chilling twist. Some survivors reported seeing unmarked vehicles follow the convoy earlier in the trip. Others described seeing a man with a radio near a power line cut-off point, gesturing at hillsides. One local informant claimed she recognized a voice among the attackers, one used to speak to police. If true, it suggests betrayal at multiple levels, not just between cartels, but within the very structures meant to maintain order. But betrayals, like shadows, are hard to prove. Official investigations stalled on some points, the exact orders given, who paid for the ammunition, who ordered that no roadblocks stop those SUVs. Witnesses recanted under pressure. Audio recordings went missing from evidence logs. One alleged key testimony, an eyewitness who said she saw vehicles with military-style uniforms among the attackers, was later discounted due to chain-of-custody issues. For families, these weren't just legal technicalities, they were wounds bleeding open. International media, NGOs, and human rights groups pressed Mexico's federal government for clarity. Were there collusion allegations between cartels and certain law enforcement officers? Did local authorities intentionally ignore warnings, or were they complicit? Diplomatic pressure rose. The U.S. State Department asked questions. The LeBarons, dual citizens, had the ear of senators and congresspeople. But political speeches and press releases couldn't reverse fire or bring back the smallest child. They could, however, shift narratives, define which version of truth got recorded in history. In the background, cartel violence spread. Retaliation killings, ambushes of small convoys, disappearances in villages, suspects arriving with severed hands, bodies dumped along desert roads. The war that many thought was distant from ranches and peaceful settlements proved otherwise. Violence in Sonora no longer confined to smuggling corridors, but bleeding into daily life, grocery trips, church services, picking up children from school, making no place safe. But perhaps the most haunting question remained: who benefited most from the chaos? Was it Los Jaguars, by weakening La Linea's presence in Sonora? Was it corrupt officials who collect bribes and allow impunity? Was it someone entirely unexpected, a cartel outsider seeking revenge for a personal vendetta? And what of the silence? The phone calls never returned, the doors shut tight. Which voices were silenced by threat, which by fear, which by choice? In looking for motive, investigators found that the deepest wounds were not from bullets, but from betrayal. As months turned into years, details emerged and then faded. Some suspects were arrested, some fled, some convicted, others disappeared. The families found small validation in legal rulings, in evidence published in forensic reports, media investigations, human rights filings. But lasting justice, the kind that changes laws, dismantles networks, protects the vulnerable, felt distant, fragile. And so the question that haunts Sonora is never only who did this, but who will stop it? Because when the answer is unknown, the danger remains. For months the investigation dragged on like a storm cloud that refused to move. Every few weeks, a headline would flicker across the news: new arrest in Sonora massacre, officials promise progress, and then fade into silence. The truth, however, was more complicated. Men caught were small players, arrested in rural safe houses, their faces tired, eyes hollow, their answers rehearsed or coerced. The people who ordered the ambush remained specters in the desert. For every cartel lieutenant captured, another quietly rose to replace him, and the war continued like a fire that burns even after the wood is gone. International attention intensified. The FBI, under pressure from U.S. lawmakers, began collaborating with Mexican authorities, sending forensic teams, analysts, and liaisons. They pored over satellite images, ballistic reports, and phone metadata. Diplomatic cables urged cooperation, speeches in Congress demanded accountability. Yet, behind closed doors, investigators admitted frustration, evidence tampered, witnesses threatened, files missing, and local prosecutors unwilling to challenge men who command entire valleys with fear alone. Justice moved forward, but each step felt like walking through quicksand. As months became years, politics layered itself over grief. Presidents invoked the tragedy in speeches, parties used it as proof of strength or failure, journalists argued over responsibility, social media turned mourning into debate. The families, unwilling to become political pawns, found themselves at the crossroads of two nations' narratives. They traveled to Washington, D.C., to Mexico City, to rallies and hearings, holding photographs of those lost, reminding everyone that behind policy and power plays were children whose laughter had been erased. Then came the lawsuits, civil actions filed in U.S. courts against cartel members and gun suppliers. Lawyers spoke of tracing weapon serial numbers, proving negligence across borders. It was unprecedented, complex, and symbolic. Yet even with international law on their side, progress was slow, tangled in bureaucracy and geopolitics. For families who once measured time by harvests and birthdays, now every passing month felt like another year without closure. On the ground in Sonora, the story changed again. New cartels entered the void, bringing more guns, more fear. Villages learned to live with convoys of armed men passing every few nights. Mothers whispered prayers when headlights appeared on roads after dark. Some people fled north, others stayed, tending farms under the gaze of hills hiding rifles. The line between survival and surrender blurred, because in a land ruled by whispers, silence is often the only form of resistance. For journalists who kept digging, the cost was high. One investigative reporter who traced the money trail linking Sonora's police payroll to cartel fronts vanished on his way home, another fled the country after receiving threats. Their notebooks became evidence, their courage turned cautionary tales. Still, their words lingered on servers and in archives, bits of truth floating between firewalls, waiting for someone brave enough to read them again. Meanwhile, survivors aged. Children who once hid in the back seats of burning cars grew into teenagers carrying invisible scars. They spoke at memorials, in classrooms, to cameras, recounting what they saw, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure forgetting was impossible. Their voices trembled, then steadied, each syllable carving the memory into history. They were the living proof that survival is both blessing and burden. Yet, amid the weight of grief, there were flickers of defiance, communities forming self-defense groups, churches opening shelters for displaced families, volunteers mapping disappearances, journalists documenting the undocumented. The desert that once echoed only gunfire began to hum with quiet rebellion, the sound of ordinary people refusing to vanish. Their courage didn't end the violence, but it did something equally dangerous to fear: it gave it a name. By 2025, the investigation's official record stood at over 1,000 pages, but even that could not contain the story. There were still gaps, missing names, redacted paragraphs, unanswered questions. Justice, it seemed, was not a single verdict but a lifelong pursuit. The families understood this. They built foundations, scholarships, and documentaries, transforming loss into legacy. In doing so, they took from the cartel something power cannot buy: remembrance. And as the film closes, the camera drifts over Sonora once more, the sun dipping beneath crimson mountains, wind sweeping across the valley, the same road stretching endless toward the horizon. The narrator's voice lowers, not with finality, but with warning, because in this land, stories like this don't end. They pause, waiting for the next echo of gunfire, the next plea for justice. The desert keeps its secrets, but it never forgets. The desert is quiet again. The wind that once carried the crack of gunfire now whispers across the stones, brushing over forgotten shell casings, melted glass, and tire tracks half buried by dust. Yet beneath that stillness lies a memory that refuses to die, a reminder that violence is never just a moment, it is a shadow that clings to generations. The same sun that warmed the children's faces that morning now sinks each evening over their unmarked graves, painting the valley in a red that looks too much like blood to be beautiful. Reporters have moved on. The soldiers are gone. The checkpoints dismantled. But the people who live here still count sunsets like heartbeats, still flinch at the echo of engines, still leave water at the roadside crosses where names have faded from the wood. They say the desert has a way of remembering, that it holds voices in its wind, that every gust carries whispers of the children who once laughed here, and of mothers who prayed as flames rose around them. In cities far away, politicians debate numbers and policies, casualties, arrests, reforms, while in the canyons of Sonora, widowed fathers repair fences and feed animals in silence. They've learned that justice rarely arrives with sirens or signatures. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of remembrance, in the decision to speak their loved ones' names aloud so the world will not erase them. The LeBaron and Langford families continue their fight, not just for punishment, but for truth. They travel, they speak, they stand before cameras and congressmen, telling and retelling what happened, refusing the comfort of forgetting. Every retelling keeps the wound open, but it also keeps the dead alive, suspended between grief and purpose. Mexico's war is not measured only by those who die, but by those forced to live with what they've seen. Teachers who bury students. Children who grow up recognizing the sound of rifles before they learn to read. Mothers who fear phone calls after dark. A nation that endures, bleeding and breathing in equal measure, because hope, however faint, is the only rebellion that violence cannot crush. When you drive that highway today, the one where the ambush took place, it looks ordinary. Asphalt patched, lines repainted, no visible scars. But if you stop, step out, and listen, the silence feels heavier than it should. Locals say sometimes, on cold nights, the wind sounds like voices, like a mother calling her children home, like laughter carried through dust. Whether that's memory or haunting, no one can say. And so the story doesn't end, it settles. It lives in the uneasy peace of those who survive, in the determination of journalists who still write, in the quiet bravery of towns that refuse to vanish. The cartels still fight. The politics still twist. The fear still lingers. But so does the truth, waiting for those who dare to look for it. Because in the end, every ambush, every betrayal, every injustice in Sonora is a mirror, reflecting not just what happened there, but what we allow to happen anywhere. The tragedy of one valley becomes the warning of a nation. The blood spilled on a lonely road becomes a map of everything we ignore until it reaches our doorstep. As the final credits roll, the voice that guided the story slows, softens, not to comfort, but to remind. That beneath the statistics are names, beneath the headlines, faces, and beneath the silence, the echo of all that was lost. You cannot kill memory. You cannot burn truth. You can only bury it, and the desert, sooner or later, always gives back what it's given. In Sonora, the wind remembers what the world forgets. If you've made it this far, it means you felt something. Maybe anger. Maybe sadness. Maybe just disbelief. But that feeling, that ache, is proof that you still care about truth in a world built on silence. Every single view, every comment, every share keeps their memory from being buried in the dust. When you interact, you breathe life back into names the world forgot. So don't scroll past this story. Don't let it vanish into the noise of the internet. Your action, right now, is louder than silence. Tap subscribe, not for me, but for them. For every life lost in the shadows, every voice silenced before it could speak. Together, we're building a place where truth can't be buried. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, then stay. Because what comes next goes even deeper. This isn't entertainment. This is remembrance. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of awareness.